steeply, you see? And you see that the rural population goes down. It's a phenomenon we see everywhere, unless it is often counteracted with certain policies that favor the rural area. So for example, Germany might be a case where we favor, in terms of public policy, the rural area. We do a lot of infrastructure projects that kind of help the rural areas to sustain. Okay, because otherwise it would be very costly for the inhabitants of Gummersbach to have access to internet. Now, through a lot of government intervention, they might at least have access to very mediocre internet. So you see, there is a kind of counter trend already. So how I call this has a fancy term, but it's very easy to understand. There are centripetal and centrifugal tendencies. And the ones of you who are more familiar with physics, they know that centripetal phases, they go into the center, and centrifugal phases go away. Okay? So when we talk about urbanization, we have to talk about the forces in the world that bring us closer together. Centripetal forces, okay, that bring us closer together. And there are certain forces, I would call them economic principles, that bring us closer together. But on the other side, you also have forces that turn us away from each other, that sprawl us, centrifugal forces. And we have to see which ones are currently stronger and how do we think about that in the future. So we have to kind of make a dance here and have to see, are in the future in my country the centripetal forces that bring us closer together, that promote urbanization stronger, or how can I make them stronger? Or are the forces that take us away from each other and maybe favor a more decentralized system with less big centers stronger? And once we understand what are the driving forces, we can analyze our current situations in our countries in regards to urbanization. Okay, I know this sounds very fancy. It is less fancy, so I will walk you through the individual steps here. But the fundamental part that you have to understand is there are forces that lead to urbanization and forces that lead away from urbanization. And we have to analyze in the contexts that we are, where and which forces are there. But first, before we go dive into, let us adopt the economic way of thinking, at least for this session. Oh no, at least for the whole week. Let us adopt the economic way of thinking. So what do you see here? Cars, congestion, okay?
Misused space.
Misused space. How can we solve this? And now let's return to the name cards. How could we solve this problem?
Like a traffic.
Amir first, Amir?
Better transport, like bicycle lanes for...
Really? Microphone?
Oh, okay. A better transport, public transport system.
Okay, yeah.
Discourage the cars and having people...
Public transport system, Alex?
I think it's fine.
Have more transportation options and urban mobility, not only above it, but also below ground for different kinds of vehicles and amounts of people being moved.
Yep.
We can also aware these reasons about the traffic rules and other things so that this problem can't create on the road.
Okay, yes? And Haj, is it still on? Okay, it's on. Okay, yeah, last one.
Oui, je pense qu'il faut réduire la volonté de se déplacer. Je m'explique. Si on rapproche le service du lieu d'habitation ou qu'on rapproche du lieu de travail du lieu d'habitation ou vice-versa, les gens auront moins envie de se déplacer parce que le déplacement est souvent une contrainte. Quand vous levez le matin et que vous prenez le bus ou toute autre forme de déplacement, c'est parce qu'il y a une nécessité. Maintenant, si vous pouvez marcher pour aller dans le lieu du travail ou pour avoir accès au service, ça va réduire la nécessité de se déplacer. Donc, on va réduire les congestions.
Okay, so what I heard from you is a lot of political solutions. We need public transport. We need bicycles. We need to bring people closer to where they work. Of course, then the question is, who decides all of this? Who decides where I am close to work? Or who decides how to allocate these spaces? Especially in cities, people are highly mobile also in their jobs. They might have, through different months, just very different jobs and different desires. So the economist way of thinking is different. The economist looks here and doesn't look at the failure of the public policy maker. Besides, he looks at one particular failure. It's too cheap to drive yourself, probably. If there are many cars on the road, it is too cheap for you still to drive. Public transport often fails because it is unattractive economically, not because it is too expensive, the public transport itself, but the opportunity is too cheap. The opportunity to travel by your own car might be too cheap. So there are creative solutions to congestion issues that people are trying, for example, specific road driving. Also you can time that nowadays, during specific times, tolls might go up and things like this. And in this way, once you pay for your demand using infrastructure, you can solve certain coordination problems. Then the policymaker doesn't have to think about what is the potential solution, but he uses the tool of the price, which tells him or her how much people demand at a certain time slot this feature, namely infrastructure. And the ones that are like driving around for a rather purposeless endeavor, they will be priced out because they're not willing to price this premium. So therefore, the economist looks at such issues from the angle of what has gone wrong in terms of pricing. If there's an overload, if we use a resource too much, probably the resource is too cheap or property rights are not clearly defined. Okay, so this is just, I want to tell you, this is the economic way of thinking. So far we always think in terms of public policy and whatever technology in our own backgrounds. Adopt a little bit, and that's what we want to do now, the economic way of thinking. So let's see how we can explain the centripetal forces, again, bringing urban sprawl, bringing urbanization closer together, from an economic perspective. The first phenomenon that we have to look at that goes into the direction of urbanization is globalization. Because now, through globalization, you have an incentivization for trade, commerce, exchange, manufacturing, and production. And you already see how this brings stuff together. It's incredibly costly if you have production there and then other things there. So you had initially, in the origins of cities, a moving together, where tradesmen were there, the transportation services for exchange for imports were there, as well as the production was there. Think of the garment industry in many of your countries, spices, whatsoever. You had kind of coming together, making trade and exchange much more possible through a lot of economic features that we have. We find property rights, the use of money, guarantees for money, and the contracts and stuff like this. The port was basically nothing else than one urbanizing force. Think of your countries. Where are some of the biggest cities? Always amongst ports. That's how they initially, a lot of them arose. Because the port was a central hub, where you had, initially, also of course production, but you had the tradesmen, you had the shipsmen, so like people engaged with all sorts of endeavors alongside of trade. And it's true until today that many of the big cities are located next to ports and next to transportation hubs. So this is the first one, how we can explain that there are certain tendencies towards centripetal forces. Next one is transaction cost. And I think this is the biggest idea that you should have in mind when you think about urbanization, also innovation. Transaction cost. If you go away from the seminar with one term, it should be transaction cost. So what is transaction cost? It means that any transaction that you are doing, there are some costs involved in making this transaction happen. So you have to search for the good that you want and the partner that you want to transact with. So there are search costs. There are information costs. So you have to look into the features that he's offering at this specific time slice. Is this relevant? You have to bargain. Of course, if you just buy whatever chewing gum, there's less bargaining cost, but as soon as contracts get much more elaborate and the sum that you're negotiating, bargaining costs and contractual costs skyrocket. Think of a lot of lawyers that are involved with big business deals. They are just basically a representation of transaction costs. So this is something that you want to reduce, obviously. And the city naturally reduces transaction cost, because if you are exposed to a lot of different sellers at one specific place, the marketplace, whatever, you reduce transaction costs, because now you can bargain at the same time with several people, or you can look up different products for different prices with very little search cost. So by bringing commerce at one center together, you already reduce transaction cost. And nowadays, many of the tech startups do nothing else than reduction of transaction cost. So for example, if you think of Airbnb and Uber, they are nothing else than transaction cost reducing companies. They do nothing else. Because in the past, when you wanted to take your ride to the airport, and let's say you have a 20-minute ride, you could take somebody in the back seat of your car, right? But how would you possibly know who also wants to go to the airport at the same time? It was impossible. You would have to post somewhere online, or you would have to know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. No. Now Uber does the matching for you. The same with Airbnb. People were not aware that there was unrented space in the middle of a city, and they want to go to a conference, so they went with the hotel. But if they would have known that for half the price they can just drop their stuff, and at one point themselves, into an empty space in the city, they would have preferred that option because it's much cheaper. So Airbnb and Uber are nothing else than reducing this part of the transaction cost. But more on this later. The third one, economies of scale, we have already heard. Okay, economies of scale are rather straightforward. If you do a lot of something, it gets cheaper at the margin. So at the margin, does somebody know what at the margin means?
And at the cost.
Say it again.
At the cost?
At the cost, yeah, but what at the marginal cost? What is at the margin?
Like the difference for if you do one transaction more. So it's the cost associated with one more transaction. If you have a lot of transactions, if you do one more, then the cost keeps getting lower and lower as you get more transactions.
Yep. So, at the margin means the next unit that you are basically looking at. And in the beginning you have a steep incline, but at one point you have learning effects, economies of scale, etc. And so at the margin it gets cheaper. And so we see that once you have a system for water supplies, it doesn't matter so much how many people you plug in after a certain threshold. Whether there are 500 or 505 people doesn't matter that much if you have established the network, okay, of water supplies. If you have policing, it literally doesn't matter to the police force if you add another 100 people to a city. There's still the same policing going on. So at the margin, you benefit from that because adding additional people is incredibly cheap. So once you have established certain services, the marginal costs are very, very small. And that drives more and more people there, because if the marginal costs are very small, but you can keep the benefits, it's a very nice equation for you. The same, of course, of infrastructure. If infrastructure is there until a threshold, adding more people doesn't create crazy marginal, doesn't have crazy marginal costs. So most of our, especially governmental services, are so-called public goods. Does somebody know what a public good is?
Everything.
Yeah?
Everything, but you can choose whatever is public goods, but it's everything that you can buy, take, use. If we talk about rent, so public goods will be the water you use, if we talk about where to rent the apartment.
Yeah, okay, next to you, immediately. Yeah.
Pour moi, c'est tout ce que les pouvoirs publics mettent en place pour que les populations puissent en bénéficier et d'adhérer.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of people also say that whatever the public good or the public requires is a public good. And let's see what I have in mind. Alex, and then I'm you.
Public parks, for example, could be one form of public good in the sense that it's for everyone's enjoyment and it's everybody's responsibility to keep it up and running.
Yeah, so it's about public enjoyment, something for the public. Amir?
Anything that we managed or provided provision to the public or public money or the taxes.
Something that we spend by public money. Last one now.
All the things which relate public daily basis needs like sanitation, water, electricity, parks, education, health, all public goods I think covered.
Okay. Last one, Elroy. You had it up and then down and then up again. So let's see.
You already placed it there, so non-rival and non-excludable. When you say non-rival, it means when I use the good. When I say non-excludable, it means when I use the good, it doesn't diminish your opportunity to use that good. And when I say non-rival, it means they don't have to compete to access that good. So let's say fireworks is a public good because if I see it, it doesn't diminish your enjoyment of that good. And we don't rival, we don't compete to have, for example, to do that. So it's a good for the public. And of course, the utilities are a form of public good because they are made such through infrastructure because they're made possible to that. They don't they move from being a common resource to a public good because of the policies that make it happen. They don't automatically become a public good because they become their first common resources, and that's a tragedy of the commons that we have to solve in public policy.
Yep. Excellent. So what you allude to, and what I also wanted to allude to, public good is how we use it in public discourse, and economics is very different. In public discourse is how you described it most often. It's something good for the public, or it is provided by the state, it is done with the public money for the sake of the public. However, that's not what economists mean. Economists mean something different. They say a public good is a good whose consumption is non-rival and non-excludable. So, what does that mean? There's rival consumption. So if I eat a cheeseburger, you cannot eat the same cheeseburger at the same time. It's rival. Okay? If I now watch at a firework in the sky, and you watch at the firework of the sky, we are non-rivalrous. We are both looking there. We don't compete for the same good. Okay? Your consumption of the firework does not diminish my consumption of the firework. So we are not rivals for the firework. We are rivals for the cheeseburger. Only one of us can eat it. But we are non-rivals for the firework. Okay? So this is non-rivalry. The second is about excludability. Can I exclude somebody from the consumption of the good? Think of the cheeseburger. I can very much exclude you from the cheeseburger. However, I can hardly take you away from the consumption of the firework. It's non-excludable, the firework. I would have to do some crazy moves to exclude you from looking at the sky, right? So, there are non-rival, non-excludable goods, and they are called public goods. Excludable goods and stuff like this, they are treated in a different way. They are, for example, private goods and stuff like this. But when we talk about public goods, we talk about a very specific and narrow sense. And keep in mind that public goods do not have to be provided by the state. There are plenty of public goods that are provided by private entities. The most famous case is lighthouses. You know lighthouses, right? Lighthouses should normally be a public good. They are non-rival, like the ship is it doesn't matter how many ships there are, and looking at the light of the lighthouse, it's non-rival. And it's also hard to exclude a ship from seeing the lighthouse. However, throughout history, most lighthouses were provided by private, and not public, by private institutions. So public goods do not have to be provided by the state necessarily. But there was a question, yeah?
Donc, en résumé, on peut dire que tout ce qui est bien public, c'est pour faire la différence entre droit de propriété, la propriété sécurité et la propriété qui est publique, dont tout le monde a accès. Est-ce qu'on peut résumer ça en termes juridiques pour dire que c'est à l'opposé de la propriété privée?
Yeah, that's a good question, how we draw the intersection between a public good and an open access good. So an open access good is like Elroy said about the tragedy of the commons. However, we would need to look into the property structure. The property structure is there different for open access, and we can go into detail later on. It's different in terms of its property structure. This just tells you something about the nature of the good. This is just about the nature of the good, while open access is something about the access to the good itself. Okay, so why do I talk about public goods? Well, public goods are better or more easily provided in cities because you make use of economies of scale. Okay, so you have a higher incentivation to have a good provision of public goods. Think of, for example, policing. Because you don't have so much marginal costs, it doesn't really matter how much people you add once you have a basic coverage of policing in the city. It doesn't matter how much people you add on top. And that makes it very attractive as a cost model, right? For any kind of public policy maker. Because now you already have a stock, and how many people you add basically doesn't matter that much. Another case, of course, is national defense. It works the same way on a country level. So economies of scale also seems to incentivize urbanization. Then there's something called cluster effects. And that's something you will often hear when we talk about urbanization. Because as we see with private businesses, they want to integrate their supply chains. They want to bring these closer together in terms of integration. We have also cluster effects for institutions on the ground. Why do we have capital cities? Well, capital cities are nothing else than making use of cluster effects of institutions. Once you have everything closely integrated together in one capital, coordination between the different elements just gets incredibly easy. Okay? So you have an integration of certain institutions. So if you would have to have all institutions dispersed in the country, there would be a lack or a severe delay in terms of communications and coordination. And this will later on, this kind of cluster effect, once you add a lot of institutional arrangements together, will play a big role when we talk about innovation. Because cities lay a very good infrastructural institutional setting for innovation. The next one is about diversity and opportunity. So in cities, you have one thing that some of you have already talked about. You have access to diverse viewpoints. So if you're in a city and you're part of a minority, if you're in a rural area and you're part of a minority, you often have a very hard time because there is not much diversity by definition in the rural communities. Therefore, you have lack of opportunity, not only economically, but also for self-flourishing. Think of, for example, of let's say a gay minority in certain parts of the rural community. They will have a very hard time, while in many countries you find that they are very welcome within urban settings. So what we have seen in the past history is that not only diversity in terms of lifestyles, but also diversity in terms of economic preferences has been incentivized. Once you have a specific strength, if you want to take a specific occupation, your likelihood that you will find somebody with whom you can match your skills is much, much higher in the city. There's just much more human capital, much more opportunity to match yourself with. So very trivial. But the same that applies for lifestyles and economics applies for all sorts of perspectives. You will just find much more people who think alike with you. And this, you can see the implications of this in two big case studies, cities, let's take in the United States. So this is the city of Detroit, and this is the city of Houston, Texas, I think. No, what's the city in Texas which is so hip right now?
Austin.
Austin, yes, not Houston. Austin, Texas. Okay. Does somebody know what's the difference between Detroit and Austin, Texas?
What caliber gun you get shot with? What caliber gun you get shot with?
I think Austin is a rather safe place, but okay, fair enough. Does somebody know what Detroit is suffering from?
Well, Le Mans, being Detroit, used to be a hub for the car industry, whereas Austin is a hub for modern technology. And when you look at the development of both cities, they go pretty much in opposite directions right now.
Yeah.
I don't know much about Austin, but I do know that Detroit suffers from a huge gap in the center of the city because all the commerce and all the growth happened maybe in a centrifugal force, as you were saying. Actually, the opposite of centrifugal force. So towards the outside, and then centrifugal force, and then the heart of the city was left almost abandoned, and they're really working hard on trying to bring back people into the center.
Yeah. So Detroit suffered from one thing. Detroit suffered from the fact that the car industry, they were reliant on basically one company, Ford, right? And so being hit by the crisis of Ford, but also the general car industry, manufacturer industry in decline, they did not accommodate for that. They put everything in one basket, and cities allow you to punish that as a consumer of a city, namely a citizen. You can vote with your feet. The city of Detroit, and I recommend you to read on this, in terms of its politics, has done everything to the cater of need of Ford and the automobile industry. And they didn't encourage diversity in their city and economic opportunities. They said if you are a Detroiter, you work for Ford and you enjoy the Detroit Pistons or whatsoever. There was no diversity in the city. It was a big, big city at that time. However, things have changed, and what people have said, well, here is no future for us. We go to other cities in the United States, and moving within the country was rather easy. So now what we see is that people move to cities like Austin, Texas, which is one of the most startup-friendly cities in the US. It's called the second Silicon Valley, because the Silicon Valley suffers at the moment, obviously, from a lot of problems of rent. It's very expensive if you want to live in the San Francisco area, Bay Area. So people also vote with their feet and move away. And Austin offers this diversity. There are different startup hubs. There's not one industry dominating everything. Okay? And this is the thing that makes cities strong. In Detroit, didn't understand that they as a city can only sustain and grow if they cater to the strength of a city, namely providing diverse economic opportunities, provide diverse lifestyle and cultural opportunities for people. Okay, so this is a live case study of cities didn't understand why they became a city itself. And this was just bad politics. There are many nice papers on the case of Detroit where you see that several mayors hijacked the system over time and streamlined the city towards one industry in very deliberate terms. The next one is linked to learning. And it's kind of later on linked to the paradox that we will have seen in modern day societies. But the question how we generate knowledge can basically be explained by understanding the three pillars of social knowledge, and then how we learn from each other. There are three dimensions to social knowledge generation. One is that knowledge about a social solution is dispersed. And dispersed means that no single mind has access to all relevant information, but that the knowledge and the solution is dispersed in individual minds in society. Okay? So each of us has a different part of the relevant puzzle in their minds. Okay, that means dispersed. There is no central planner who has access to all relevant information. By the way, this was kind of the illusion of the Soviet planning at one point, that they thought they could actually plan these kind of things. Second, contextual and local. We learn, or we can develop solutions once we are aware of the contextual knowledge of our distinct problem. Local contextual knowledge. And the last one is called tacit knowledge. Does somebody know what tacit knowledge is? Tacit knowledge?
You learn by example.
Is it by yourself?
When you learn by example.
Via something? Exactly via what?
By example.
By example? Yeah, almost. You understand?
It reminds me of the story of the Columbus egg. It's something that once you realize it, it becomes obvious to everyone.
Yeah, to a certain
As
degree.
implicit.
Implicit, we are getting there. Implicit. Implicit means that, or in this case tacit means, it's knowledge you cannot articulate. Okay? It's knowledge you cannot articulate. There's knowledge like this right now that I articulate to you, and you can write it down and absorb it, and then you also have access to the knowledge. However, there's a lot of tacit knowledge, and it's what Luciano said with kind of by example. It's learning from mimicking others. Okay? So imitating, yeah, you observe others. For example, here's a good tip leading from this. If you're in the bookshop, in the airport, never buy management books. Because management is something that is hard to articulate. And most of the skills of great leaders is if you mimic their behavior, not if you buy into their big story. Okay? Their big story is often unarticulatable knowledge that they could not articulate themselves. Often we are not even aware of knowledge that we possess. Another example is riding a bike. Can you articulate how to ride a bike? My students always say they can, and then they try, like, you have to lift your feet with like at a 35-degree angle and then push down with 500 kilojoule for like this, and at the same time you have to coordinate not to fall off the bike. So it's impossible. And we learn such things as riding a bike and other things by mimicking, by being exposed to people who do it right. And that's why you see that great leaders often have mentoring great leaders. Not because they tell them the right stuff, it's because they are around the great leaders all the time, and therefore have an easier time to mimic stuff. And this happens in cities. Now you are surrounded by a plurality of very interesting people from whom you can learn without them having you to teach things. You observe things and how things are done, and you can imitate them. And so you have something that is very precious, and that can never be replaced by online learning. You can mimic what other people do very well. And that's, Hussein? Yes, please.
How is it different from experience then?
Yeah, okay. So, of course you have an experience, and we have experience all the time, but an experience is an unstructured learning approach. While you go out and, as Hayek says, you mimic a certain practice that you have deliberately observed, you learn, of course, by experience, but you have a deliberate outcome, namely you mimic that behavior. Okay? So you see and observe a certain practice, a certain skill, and you adopt it from mimicking this behavior. So a lot of social norms are nothing else than you induce tacit knowledge into it. Amir?
Is it something like trial and error? Trial and error thing that you...
Yes, trial and error is part of it, but tacit knowledge is really, it's knowledge that that the people who possess it can't teach you by using language. You learn it by observing them and by mimicking them. And that makes it different. It's also a bit different from learning by doing. Learning by doing is I learn something because I practice it multiple times. No. It's really that one of the benefits of bringing very skilled people together is that you can mimic some of their behaviors. And it's part of our cultural evolutionary process to kind of mimic good behaviors. That's how social norms evolve, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say that when we say we are social animals, we mean that we can mimic things. So experience could be, you could do the same thing over and over and over again, and you would gain a lot of experience, but you wouldn't learn anything. So you have to have this input from other people in order to increase knowledge. So that would be a difference between experience and knowledge.
I mean, this concept, of course, is deeply intertwined, but knowledge doesn't, like experience, everything is experience. It's a vast array of everything. Tacit knowledge is a particular practice that you pick up from mimicking. And we cannot stress how important that is. That is like one of the core features that also societal learning in cities and social groups makes so precious. And we'll talk about this more in a second. But I think this learning process, this specific learning process, has led to a lot of innovation. So, for example, here we have seen the elevator has enabled what? Well, let's say this is basically, I think there's this Crystal Palace in the UK. This is one of the first iron cast buildings, like with iron skillet basically around, and then you have elevators. What do these innovations enable us?
That's great.
Precisely. One of the big innovations that you need for cities, and that made life in cities so, in fact, cheap and affordable. Because after all, our cities don't go that way, but in the best possible cases, they go that way. And the elevator is nothing else than a highway, because it's very fast, a highway in this way, in the horizontal. And not, no, in the vertical, not in the horizontal. The horizontal sprawl is what you have to avoid, because then you get vast cities where commuting from one part to the other is just incredibly long and costly. But now you have this high speed in our buildings. And it made housing initially very affordable, if you look at the case of New York City, because now you could just put stuff on top of each other, houses on top of houses. Unfortunately, we have nobody from Hong Kong here, but you know, if you look at Hong Kong, it's basically an incredibly dense area. And without this invention of the skyscraper, it would not have been possible. And this invention of the skyscraper is often hijacked. Think of zoning regulations, height regulations, and stuff like this that we have in cities. The city of London, where I live, there are regulations how high you can build, and therefore there's not many skyscrapers in certain parts of the city. And then we wonder, of course, why house prices are so expensive. It's like artificial scarcity. But more about this in a second. How this thing has been developed is not one specific part, one specific innovator. But there were a couple of people in Chicago at that time who were working on very similar issues and then came together. They saw that the urbanization at that time in Chicago provided a certain need for something. They came together, and through learning with each other and the cluster effects, they created one of the miraculous inventions that we have, namely the skyscraper. So, what makes all this innovation in cities possible? First, voting with your feet. We now know that Detroit is less favored by people than Austin, Texas. Because people moved. They wanted to work in what they found more promising industries, in the tech industry, in their whatever, small scale startup scene, rather than in the manufacturing car business. So once you have an influx with people who want to create something and they can vote with their feet what they find desirable, you have a clustering of innovation. And with this kind of mechanism that innovative people can come together, you basically create little laboratories. It's not for granted that the Silicon Valley has to be the innovation hub for the next couple of years. There are already other people starting, innovating somewhere else because the framework of the Silicon Valley has become too restrictive for them. And if something is too restrictive, normally we have to kind of bear with it, but cities make it possible for us to just vote with our feet for right institutions that provide us with the right framework. The city of Detroit didn't allow, by its institutions, that people are innovative, that they start their own business. It was not small business friendly, for example. It didn't provide them with the digital infrastructure that they needed. Then they voted with their feet. They literally went away and chose another infrastructure arrangement. In this case, I picked the city of Austin, Texas. And this is how you create kind of laboratory experiments where you can bolster and foster innovation. And this leads basically to a spirit and a culture that you only have in the city. And this is what many urban young people will tell you. And urban young people over all generations, you know. The culture of cities has always been distinctly different. And this comes back from Athenian times. So this is the, of course, old Athenian ideal of the city, where the debate and the progressive debates were going on. So the cities has been an old invention, an old artifact. And nowadays, you have also, of course, big, like the Silicon Valley, big corporations or big infrastructural and tech clusters all together, and they have a certain spirit. Think of the spirit of Silicon Valley. It's very different from any other city or from any other region in the country. So it has this distinct spirit. And this spirit has produced this chart. Does somebody know the chart? It's often called the most important chart in human history. Alex, yeah?
Communication chart?
Either CO2 emissions or amount of people.
Okay, either CO2 emissions or amount of people. Luciano?